Thank you for inviting me, and this is an opportunity also to say something about a formation and a research project which has been going on for several years at the Academy of Fine Art here in Copenhagen. And the program you were mentioning in your presentation is in fact heading towards its end. We think that it will be transformed somehow during next year. And so in fact this art theory program I have been heeding and somehow directing for 25 years is changing in its contents and perhaps also in its scientific direction, and that could be perhaps even very useful to say something about that. It started in fact as a problem of the avant-garde and the relationship to capitalism. So in fact, and in several of the first texts we produced, we were discussing this relationship between projection and production of the piece. Projection was traditionally in the avant-garde connected with the problem of what we call in the German and Norwegian language Hæfter. And it is very difficult to translate this word, Hæfter. It is in fact a theological notion, and to a certain degree it contains a unity between deadline and projection, between change thanks to a deadline and a projection on something different coming up. It is a notion implicating something very acute and something which has to do with necessity more than with freedom, in fact. So the artistic intentionality depends upon this. And the other thing was, of course, if it was possible to defend the presence of such a dramatic intentionality and project making in the material production of the piece. This is a question which became very radical in '68, as you may imagine, because at that time the alternative notions of art were of course bound to a critique of the form of price, the form of wage labor, and the form of the art market. So from the start it was evident that there would be a sort of conflict between this notion of Hæfter and the artistic intentionality implicated by this notion and the production of the piece, the material production of the piece. So around 12 years ago we tried to make an analysis of what was going on in a material production of a piece. And of course if it is produced by a single artist and not by several employed assistants, it has an identity which is more or less artisanal and traditional, and can be stated as a sort of auto-exploitation by the artist. But it becomes much more difficult when we have several assistants working, and it has been really complicated since so many artists started to produce the pieces in China or in other countries where cheap labor forces were at hand. And it became evident that the problem of exploitation developed radically during these last, shall we say, 12 or 15 years, bound to the presence of Chinese labor force and the fact that it could be so easily integrated in artistic projects. So we had really, what should we call it, an augmentation of exploitation, and the problem of exploitation became a major one. So it's not so much as a problem of critique of neoliberalism or of the market. It's more a critique of the process of production itself, which has become important. This is one of the problems we have been dealing with. The other one is, of course, the problem of the artistic exigence to the piece. Can it be somehow separated? And this has to do, of course, with the ethics of construction, the attention towards the detail, the attention also towards the integrity of the project, not accepting compromises due to the fact that the piece should be produced elsewhere, or due to the fact that the piece should be shown somewhere. This is also a problem going back to '68, and it was labeled the critique of society of spectacle at that time, which meant that in fact every presentation contained a problem, because every presentation could be consumed as a spectacular confirmation of a media system. And this position of critique, of integration, recuperation, and even institutional critique was an important one at the time. This means, and that is the philosophical difficulty is, of course, that you have to accept, if this critique is correct, that art is a clear category. And that's also why I intervened before when we were discussing contingency. But because perhaps art is not a category which is easy to manipulate or to integrate, and perhaps it has another way of functioning which has to do with the life of the mind. That's why I have given you this quotation of Hannah Arendt. I would like to submit to your attention. Hannah Arendt, and I hope you all have this piece of paper. This was one of her last works, the second volume, The Willing. In fact, Hannah Arendt was, with the life of the mind, working with a separation of three investigations, which corresponded to a certain degree to the separation of the three critiques of Immanuel Kant. And the first one was about understanding and very near the problem of scientific rationality. And the second one, about the willing, had to do with intentionality and had also to do with a critique of the will. And in this text, which should have been followed by a third one about judging and about reflection, which would have corresponded to the aesthetic critique of judgment of Kant. In this second part, she quotes Nietzsche more or less in the middle of the second volume, and she quotes a long quote, in fact, from a very late piece of work of Nietzsche. German philosophy is the most fundamental form of homesickness there has ever been. One is no longer at home anywhere. At last, one longs back for that place in which alone one can be at home, the Greek world, which is also a problem for the artistic homesickness, because the Greek work is, as you know, also the world of form, the world of unity between formal and theoretical preoccupations, at least since Johann Winkelmann 300 years ago, and of course also enthusiasm and Dionysic expansion of enthusiasm and desire. So the Greek word is also, to a certain degree, a basic preoccupation for art theory and art investigations. But it is in precisely that, Nietzsche continues, in that direction that all bridges are broken, except the rainbow bridges of concepts. So in fact, Nietzsche is preparing our turn toward conceptual art at the end of the 80s in the 19th century. And it is true that to redefine something concerning formal and theoretical preoccupation in art, the rainbow bridge of concept is a useful mean, because it's somehow situated between the categories, and it confirms something which has to do with the exteriority of art in relation to all categories. I shall come back to that in a moment. Hannah Arendt comments, and this is very important also in relationship to what was said before about identity. I did not want to cross, Hannah Arendt comments, I did not want to cross the rainbow bridge of concepts. Perhaps because I'm not homesick enough. In any event, because I do not believe in a world, be it a past world or a future world, be it a nostalgical thing or a projection of some sort, in which man's mind, equipped for withdrawing from the world of appearances, could or should ever be comfortably at home. This is, of course, a very important statement, because Britain, as it is in the 70s, in the middle of the 70s, it is in fact 7 years after May '68, and not only the triumph, but also the defeat of radical critique, as the Situationist one, and also several others. The Fluxus one could be mentioned in the same context, and in fact defending something which has to do with the eternity of the internal exile, the possibility of an interiority which is radically different for the contextual preoccupation of the artistic effort. And I think this is important, because that means that perhaps, and I think that should be the supposition when we are dealing with a political or even an ethical critique of the conditions of art making and art presentation, that is that even if we suppose a society where money and the state have been abolished, that means that we have a system of distribution of goods and also presentation of artworks, which does not mean does not have to exploit Chinese labor force or anything like that, and can be presented openly and freely for everyone. Even if that should be the case, that we had such a society without money and without state, we would still have this problem of formal solutions, theoretical solutions, investigations of art, research into the problem of what form is about, and also, of course, about what the passion of formation is about. So I was also very glad to see the quotation from Luigi Pareson, which was defended a while ago, because Luigi Pareson was one of the first presenting a hermeneutic of form. And I think he was very close to one of the main problems of the hermeneutic of form. That is, that the commentary of the form is the primordial thing. The making of it is a part of the commentary of the form. And the reflection over the commentary and the making of the form are integrated in the same artistic effort. I have mentioned in the paper announcing this intervention of mine that I would like to critique the imperative of expression going around, which has manifested itself so radically in this country, but also in others. But it started here in 2006, and so the Danish culture and the Danish politics is in fact to be blamed for it. And this problem of the imperative of expression, which we also call the cartoon crisis, is a sort of manipulation of the profanating force of art. Profanation is also an important notion in this context, because profanation can go both ways. It can be a profanation towards the top, and it can be a profanation toward the bottom of the refugees and the people coming from another context and trying to avoid some of the political forms they have been dealing with. In fact, all sort of refugee movement is also a critique, of course, even if it has also to do with staying alive and trying to maintain family and health in better conditions than the previous one. And staying alive is perhaps the most important thing, of course, in this context of art discussion. And I would end with something concerning the position of Agamben in this case. As you may know, the project of Homo Sacer, which ended in September 2014, was the last volume about how to use our bodies. I paraphrased it a little, but it was more or less about that. It is really defending the problem of life in potentiality and also in artistic making. So it can never be the case for artistic making to try to integrate themselves in some sort of sacrificial logic, where you sacrifice for the sake of freedom, not to mention, of course, for the sake of money or for the sake of state. And in a certain degree, this text about the use of the bodies of Agamben is also a defense of inoperosity. It's not a passivity. It's not inactivity. Inoperosity, this key notion of Agamben. It has more to do with being prepared, with being ready, and to a certain degree, it has to do with maintaining a readiness of understanding and intervention without intervening. So it has to do with a special sort of attention towards key problems, not only of art making, of course, but also of political domination in general, and not sacrificing art for the sake of anything else, not sacrificing human efforts for the sake of anything else. And this critique of sacrifice is, of course, very important when we are dealing with a society with an imperative of expression, which is trying to manipulate the artistic exigencies towards something which has to do with confirming freedom. So, and I think Arendt was on that direction when she was developing her analysis of the will and her critique of the free will. It was in fact that it's not a problem of artistic freedom or an institutional necessity. It's more a problem of really understanding what intervention is and be open to something which is outside the categories. And that is the last thing I will say. We have a tradition in Marxism and in Kantian ethics to try to see if we can define ethics and aesthetics using the categories of understanding developed in Kantian transcendent rationality, or of course in the production of surplus value in the Marxist system. But I think that the crisis we had in Kantian thinking with around Emil Lask and the split between Cassirer and Husserl and this very, very important critique of the Kantian categories means that we have opened up the philosophical preparation to something different, where we can try to state something about the extra-categorical, the elements which are not easy to integrate in any category. That may also be why it's so difficult for a museum to establish a clear ethical norm for its behavior, as you were saying and showing before, because it has to do with attention and perhaps local interventions much more than a general category of ethics. So Emil Lask was the one who tried to understand the extra-categorical And he arrived to at least two positions which are important here. They have to do with immanence, and they have to do with practice, with the operativity of this field. And I think that we, without many problems, can place at least three forms of human manifestations in the extra-categorical. And that is, of course, art, love, and revolution. They are outside the categories. Thank you.